At 2:35 in the afternoon on April 8, 1941, a massive four-engine aircraft thundered down a runway outside Tokyo. Engineers from Nakajima stood silently along the tarmac, watching as the largest bomber Japan had ever attempted clawed its way into humid spring sky. For 18 months, they had worked in secrecy. They had invested enormous resources. They had studied every rivet, every system, every structural line. A revolutionary American airliner. Officially, that aircraft had crashed. Unofficially, it had become the foundation for something far more ambitious. Now, as the prototype lifted into the air for its first test flight, the Imperial Japanese Navy hoped it was witnessing the birth of a long-range strategic bomber capable of projecting power deep across the Pacific. But within minutes, it was clear something was wrong. The climb was sluggish. The controls felt heavy. The engine strained under the aircraft's weight. What had once been one of the most advanced commercial airliners in the world had been transformed into something far less graceful. To understand how this happened, we have to go back several years, back to the United States, where the original aircraft had been conceived not as a weapon of war, but as the future of passenger travel. In 1935, American commercial aviation was entering what many would later call its golden age. Airlines were expanding rapidly. Public confidence in air travel was growing, and aircraft manufacturers were racing to build faster, larger, and more comfortable airplanes. The Douglas Aircraft Company had already changed the industry with the DC-3. Reliable, efficient, and profitable, the DC-3 allowed airlines to operate without relying heavily on government mail contracts. It quickly became the backbone of American air travel. But even before the DC-3 had fully reshaped the market, airline executives were thinking bigger. William Patterson, president of United Airlines, approached Douglas with a bold proposal. He wanted an aircraft that would surpass the DC-3 in every measurable way. It would carry 42 passengers in daytime configuration, or 30 sleeper berths for overnight transcontinental service. It would cross the United States without refueling. It would feature air conditioning. It would include cabin pressurization to fly above turbulent weather. No such land plane existed. At the time, four-engine aircraft were rare in commercial service, and those that did exist were typically flying boats. Patterson was asking Douglas to design something unprecedented, a large land-based four-engine airliner that combined performance, range, comfort, and reliability on a scale never before attempted. The technical risk was enormous. The financial risk was equally daunting. Douglas agreed to move forward only after other major airlines joined the effort. American Airlines, Eastern Airlines, Pan American Airways, and Transcontinental and Western Air all committed funds. Each airline contributed $100,000 toward development. Together, they created a $500,000 pool to launch the project. What emerged from Douglas's design offices was known as the DC for E, the E standing for experimental. The engineering challenges were staggering. The aircraft would weigh over 60,000 pounds. It would require 4 Pratt & Whitney R2-1800 twin Hornet engines, each producing approximately 1,450 horsepower. The wing had to be strong enough to support the engines and fuel load, yet light enough to maintain acceptable performance. Douglas engineers produced more than 8,000 detailed drawings. Wind tunnel testing consumed hundreds of hours. Structural analysis pushed existing methods to their limits. Over 1.3 million rivets would ultimately hold the prototype together. One of the most innovative features was its tricycle landing gear. Unlike earlier large aircraft that sat nose-high on tail wheels, the DC-3 stood level on the ground. This improved pilot visibility during taxi and takeoff, simplified passenger boarding, and represented a major step toward modern airliner design. The tail was equally distinctive. Instead of a single large vertical stabilizer, the DC-4 used 3 vertical fins. This was not simply aesthetic. It was practical. A single tall fin would have made the aircraft too high to fit into existing hangars. The triple tail arrangement allowed sufficient stability without excessive height. Inside, the aircraft was luxurious by late 1930s standards. The wide cabin provided space for sleeper berths and comfortable seating. Air conditioning enhanced passenger comfort. The electrical systems operated on alternating current, an advanced choice at the time. A complex hydraulic system, power controls, and landing gear. An auxiliary power unit allowed ground operations without running the main engines. On June 7, 1938, the prototype, registered NX-18100, made its first flight from Clover Field in Santa Monica, California. At the controls was Carla Nansen Cover, Douglas's chief test pilot, and a veteran of earlier DC series first flights. The takeoff roll was long. The aircraft was heavy and powerful, but it required careful handling. Once airborne, however, it demonstrated stability and controllability. The first flight lasted approximately 45 minutes and was considered a success. Yet as flight testing continued, problems began to emerge. The DC-4E was extraordinarily complex. Its advanced systems required maintenance beyond what most airline mechanics were accustomed to. Fuel consumption was higher than expected. Performance margins were thinner than originally calculated. Weight continued to creep upward as modifications were made. By May 5, 1939, the Civil Aeronautics Authority granted the aircraft its type certificate. United Airlines took the prototype into operational evaluation service. But real-world airline use exposed the aircraft's limitations. It was too heavy, too complicated, too expensive to operate efficiently. Airlines that had initially funded the project began to withdraw. The vision of a luxurious four-engine transcontinental flagship gave way to economic reality. The DC-4E, for all its innovation, was not commercially viable in its existing form. Douglas had invested nearly $3 million in development, with no production orders forthcoming. The company faced a difficult decision. They chose to design a simplified version, what would eventually become production DC-4, while seeking a buyer for the lone DC-4E prototype. That buyer would come from an unexpected direction. In late 1939, representatives of Mitsui Trading Company approached Douglas with interest in purchasing the aircraft. Officially, the aircraft was being acquired for Japan Airlines, known domestically as Dai Nippon Koku. The price agreed upon was $950,000. To Douglas, it was an opportunity to recover some of the heavy development costs tied up in the prototype. International tensions were rising, but the United States had not yet entered the war. The sale was approved. What Douglas did not fully appreciate was that the real end user was not a civilian airline. The Imperial Japanese Navy had recognized something significant in the DC-4E's design. Its long range, structural strength, and four-engine configuration suggested possibilities far beyond passenger transport. By acquiring the aircraft, Japanese engineers gained access to advanced American aeronautical technology they intended to study, replicate, and adapt for military purposes. The DC-4E was disassembled, shipped across the Pacific, and delivered to Japan. Once there, it was quietly examined, measured, and reverse-engineered. Japanese engineers analyzed its systems, structure, and aerodynamics. The aircraft was reportedly given a cover story suggesting it had been destroyed in an accident, masking its true fate. From this American commercial experiment, the Imperial Japanese Navy hoped to derive the foundation for a long-range heavy bomber. But copying an aircraft is not the same as understanding it, and transforming a sophisticated airliner into a strategic weapon would prove far more difficult than anticipated. By April 1941, as Nakajima's modified bomber prototype lifted reluctantly into the Tokyo sky, the consequences of that ambitious gamble were beginning to show. The story of the DC-4E had already spanned continents, from American boardrooms to Japanese military workshops. What began as a symbol of commercial progress was now entangled in the machinery of war. And the next phase would reveal just how far technology can travel and how dangerous it can become when ambition outpaces capability. By the time the DC-4E arrived in Japan, the world had already begun sliding toward total war. Officially, the aircraft had been purchased by Dai Nippon Koku. Unofficially, it was transferred almost immediately to the Imperial Japanese Navy. There, under tight security, engineers began an exhaustive examination of what was, at the time, one of the most sophisticated land-based airliners ever built. This was not a casual inspection. The aircraft was carefully disassembled. Panels were removed. Systems were mapped. Structural members were measured and redrawn. Japanese engineers studied the wing design, the tricycle landing gear configuration, the hydraulic systems, and electrical architecture. Particular attention was given to the aircraft size, load-bearing capacity, and long-range potential. Japan did not yet possess a true four-engine, land-based strategic bomber comparable in scale to what the DC-4E represented. While the nation had built capable twin-engine bombers, projecting power across vast oceanic distances required something larger, something with range, endurance, and heavy payload capability. The DC-4E appeared to offer a blueprint. However, translating a commercial airliner into a military bomber was not as simple as replacing seats with bombs. The Imperial Japanese Navy assigned Nakajima to develop a military aircraft inspired by what they had learned from the American design. The resulting project would become the Nakajima G5N, later codenamed Shinzan by the Japanese and Liz by the Allies. On paper, the G5N was ambitious. It would be a long-range, four-engine heavy bomber capable of carrying substantial bomb loads across the Pacific. Its configuration reflected clear influence from the DC-4E, a large wing, tricycle landing gear, and significant internal volume. But the similarities were structural inspiration rather than direct duplication. Japan lacked the exact engines, materials, and manufacturing processes used by Douglas, and that gap would prove critical. The engines selected for the G5N were Nakajima NK-7A Memori power plants. In theory, they would provide sufficient horsepower to move the massive airframe. In practice, they were underdeveloped and unreliable. Cooling problems, vibration issues, and inconsistent output plagued early testing. Weight also became a recurring problem. As military requirements were added, bomb bays, defensive gun positions, reinforced structure, the aircraft grew heavier than originally intended. The balance between power and mass tilted in the wrong direction. When the prototype flew on April 8, 1941, the results were deeply disappointing. Performance was poor. Climb rate was inadequate. Handling was sluggish. The engine struggled to deliver consistent power. What had looked promising in design studies faltered in real-world conditions. The aircraft that Japan had hoped would become its answer to long-range American bombers was already compromised before it entered service. Despite these shortcomings, development continued. Wartime urgency left little room for abandoning large projects. Japan needed heavy bombers, and substantial resources had already been committed. A small number of G5N aircraft were produced. Some were modified into transport variants, redesignated G5N2L, in an attempt to salvage usefulness from the troubled platform. But the bomber itself never achieved operational success. Mechanical reliability issues persisted. Performance remained below expectations. Ultimately, only a limited number were built, and they saw minimal combat effectiveness. The attempt to transform captured commercial innovation into a strategic military asset had fallen short. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Douglas had not abandoned the four-engine airliner concept. The failure of the DC-4E in commercial service did not mean the idea was fundamentally flawed. It meant the execution had been overly complex. Douglas engineers returned to the drawing board with a clear objective: simplify. The result was a redesigned aircraft that retained the essential four-engine configuration and long-range capability, but eliminated many of the experimental features that had complicated the DC-4E. The triple tail was replaced with a single vertical stabilizer. Systems were simplified. Weight was reduced. Maintenance accessibility was improved. This new design became the production DC-4. Unlike its experimental predecessor, the production DC-4 would not enter civilian service immediately. Global war reshaped priorities. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American industry shifted rapidly toward military production. The U.S. Army Air Forces adopted the DC-4 as the C-54 Skymaster. The U.S. Navy designated its version the R-5D. In military service, the aircraft proved far more successful than the DC-4 had ever been in civilian trials. The C-54 became a backbone of Allied logistics. It transported troops, cargo, and critical supplies across oceans and continents. It flew the North Atlantic routes to Britain, supported operations in North Africa, and later played a key role in Pacific theater logistics. The aircraft's range, payload capacity, and reliability made it invaluable. In contrast to the troubled G5N program in Japan, the American evolution of the four-engine transport concept flourished under wartime demands. One of the most famous uses of the C-54 would come after the war, during the Berlin airlift. But even before that, its contribution to Allied victory was immense. The irony was stark. The original DC for E sold abroad and ultimately serving as inspiration for an unsuccessful Japanese bomber, had failed commercially. Yet its simplified successor became one of the most important transport aircraft of the war. On opposite sides of the Pacific, two very different outcomes had emerged from a single technological starting point. The Nakajima G5N program illustrates the complexity of industrial imitation during wartime. Reverse engineering can reveal structure and configuration, but cannot instantly transfer manufacturing experience, material science expertise, or engine development maturity. Douglas has spent years refining large aircraft production techniques. American engine manufacturers like Pratt & Whitney had extensive development pipelines and industrial capacity. Japan, facing resource constraints and escalating conflict, struggled to replicate that ecosystem. The G5NS engines remained a persistent weakness. Attempts were made to substitute alternative power plants, but improvements were limited. As the war intensified, priorities shifted toward aircraft designs that could be produced more efficiently and with proven performance. In the end, the G5N never became the long-range strategic bomber the Navy had envisioned. It remained an ambitious but flawed experiment, born from foreign technology, constrained by domestic limitations. By 1943, the program was effectively sidelined. The DC, for itself, did not survive the war in recognizable form. Its physical structure in Japan was ultimately scrapped after testing and evaluation, but its legacy lived on in two very different ways. In Japan, it influenced a failed heavy bomber project that highlighted the challenges of rapid technological adaptation under wartime pressure. In the United States, it indirectly contributed to the development of a transport aircraft that would help sustain Allied global operations. The story is not one of simple technological theft or straightforward replication. It is a case study in how innovation travels and how context determines success or failure. The same foundational design principles produced two dramatically different outcomes. One became a logistical lifeline across continents. The other struggled to leave the runway. As the war progressed, four-engine aircraft would become increasingly central to global strategy. The United States fielded heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator in massive numbers. Long-range strategic bombing reshaped modern warfare. Japan, meanwhile, never fully closed the gap in heavy land-based bomber capability. Its focus remained more heavily oriented toward naval aviation and medium bombers. The missed opportunity represented by the G5N underscored a broader industrial imbalance that would define much of the Pacific War. What began as a commercial partnership proposal in 1935 had, by the early 1940s, evolved into a story of divergence. Two nations taking the same basic technological inspiration in radically different directions. And as the conflict intensified, those differences in industrial capacity, engineering infrastructure, and production scalability would play an increasingly decisive role. The DC for E was never mass-produced. It never carried paying passengers across the continent. It never became the strategic bomber Japan had hoped to build. But its brief, complex existence connected pre-war commercial ambition with wartime industrial reality, bridging boardrooms, test fields, secret naval workshops, and global battlefields. In the next phase of the story, the focus shifts from experimental ambition to operational impact, where production DC-4 and its military variants would help redefine global air transport during and after the war. While the Nakajima G5N struggled to justify the hopes placed upon it, the simplified American evolution of the concept was quietly proving its worth across the globe. The production DC-4, now wearing military paint and designated the C-54 Skymaster, had entered service at exactly the right moment. The United States was now fully engaged in World War II, fighting across two vast oceans. Distance had become one of the defining challenges of the conflict. Moving men, equipment, medical supplies, and critical cargo across thousands of miles was no longer a logistical luxury. It was a strategic necessity. And the C-54 was built for distance. Unlike many earlier military transports adapted hastily from civilian designs, the C-54 benefited from deliberate simplification. The overly ambitious experimental systems of the DC, for E had been stripped away. The triple tail was gone, replaced by a single large vertical stabilizer. The complex alternating current electrical architecture had been refined. Maintenance access was improved. Structural weight was optimized. The result was not glamorous, but it was dependable. Powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R2000 twin Wasp engines, the C-54 delivered reliable long-range performance. It could carry substantial payloads over intercontinental distances. It could operate from improved runways across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Most importantly, it could do so repeatedly. By 1942 and 1943, the Skymaster was flying critical routes over the North Atlantic, connecting the United States to Britain. It transported high-ranking officials, ferry pilots, essential equipment, and time-sensitive cargo. In the Pacific theater, where distances dwarfed those in Europe, the aircraft's range proved invaluable. The Pacific War was defined by geography, scattered islands, immense stretches of ocean, and supply lines that extended thousands of miles from the American mainland. Ships were vulnerable to submarine attack. Surface routes were slow. Air transport offered speed and flexibility that sea lanes could not. The C-54 became part of a growing airlift network that stitched together far-flung bases. It carried troops to staging areas. It evacuated wounded personnel. It delivered aircraft parts, communications equipment, and ammunition. As the Allies advanced, the transport network expanded with them. Unlike the troubled G5N program in Japan, which had aimed for long-range offensive bombing, but failed to deliver consistent performance, the American 4-engine transport had found its purpose not in dramatic air raids, but in sustained logistical endurance. By 1944, the C-54 was firmly established as one of the most capable long-range transports in Allied service. It was not alone. Aircraft such as the C-47 Skytrain also played enormous roles, but the C-54 filled a different niche. It carried heavier loads over greater distances. One of its most important contributions came through its integration into the Air Transport Command, ATC. The ATC operated global routes that effectively created a military airline network spanning continents. From the United States to South America, across Africa to the Middle East, onward to India and China, C-54 aircraft linked Allied operations worldwide. Flying these routes was not without danger. Crews faced unpredictable weather, limited navigation infrastructure, mechanical strain, and the constant fatigue of long-haul operations. Unlike combat squadrons that received public recognition, transport crews often worked in relative anonymity. Yet, their contribution was foundational. The war could not have been sustained without them. The aircraft's reliability became especially important in extreme climates. In Arctic conditions, it flew supply missions to Alaska and the Soviet Union as part of the Lend-Lease program. In tropical heat, it supported operations across the South Pacific. High altitudes, remote airstrips, and underdeveloped infrastructure tested both aircraft and crew, but the C-54 endured. As World War II drew toward its conclusion in 1945, the role of long-range transport shifted from purely military logistics to humanitarian and political necessity. The most famous chapter in the C-54's post-war service began in 1948. The city of Berlin, deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, became the focal point of a Cold War crisis. When the Soviet Union blockaded ground access routes to West Berlin, the Western Allies faced a stark choice: abandon the city or supply it entirely by air. They chose the airlift. The Berlin airlift became one of the most remarkable sustained air transport operations in history. C-54 Skymasters formed the backbone of the effort. Day and night, in tightly controlled air corridors, aircraft flew food, coal, medicine, and essential supplies into a city cut off from the outside world. At peak intensity, aircraft were landing in Berlin every few minutes. The operation demanded extraordinary coordination. Pilots flew in poor weather, Ground crews unloaded cargo with remarkable speed. Maintenance teams worked tirelessly to keep aircraft operational. The C-54, once an outgrowth of a failed experimental airliner, now stood at the center of a geopolitical standoff between superpowers. It was a moment that underscored how dramatically the fate of the four-engine Douglas design had diverged from its Japanese counterpart. The G5N had faded into obscurity during the war, limited by mechanical shortcomings and strategic shifts. The American transport, by contrast, became a symbol of resilience and logistical power. Meanwhile, the broader commercial aviation industry was preparing for a new era. With the war over, manufacturers once again turned their attention to civilian markets. The production DC was adapted for post-war airline service. Surplus military C-54 aircraft were converted into passenger transports. Airlines across the United States and around the world acquired these aircraft at relatively low cost. The dream that William Patterson had articulated in 1935, long-range, multi-engine commercial air travel, was finally becoming widespread reality. Passengers now flew across continents in aircraft derived from wartime transports. What had once been cutting-edge military logistics technology transitioned into global civil aviation infrastructure. Airlines in Europe, North America, Latin America, and beyond incorporated DC-4s into their fleets. The aircraft proved well-suited to rebuilding international air networks disrupted by war. In this post-war environment, the legacy of the DC-4 lived on indirectly. Its experimental lessons, what worked and what did not, had informed a more practical design. The simplified DC-4 succeeded precisely because it avoided the overcomplication that had undermined its predecessor. Back in Japan, the wartime years had strained industrial capacity to its limits. The failure of the G5N was only one of many technological challenges faced by a nation fighting an increasingly defensive war. Resource shortages, strategic bombing, and industrial disruption constrained aircraft development. By the time the war ended in 1945, Japan's aviation industry lay in ruins. The grand ambitions tied to projects like the G5N were overshadowed by broader national devastation. The original DC-4 that had been shipped across the Pacific no longer existed in usable form. Its physical structure had long since been dismantled. What remained was a memory of an ambitious attempt to leap forward technologically under the pressures of looming war. The contrast between the two trajectories could not have been clearer. One path led to a troubled heavy bomber program that never fulfilled its strategic promise. The other led to one of the most important transport aircraft families of the mid-20th century, serving in war, crisis, and peace. Yet, both stories were born from the same experimental airliner, introduced in 1938. The DC-4 may have failed in its original commercial role, but it triggered a chain of events that reshaped aviation on both sides of the Pacific. It revealed the risks of over-engineering. It demonstrated the limits of reverse engineering without industrial depth, and it proved that innovation often succeeds not in its first form, but in its refinement. As the post-war world accelerated into the jet age, piston engine transports like the DC-4 would eventually give way to faster, pressurized successors. But their impact on global mobility and military logistics was lasting. In the next chapter of the story, we will explore how the evolution of Douglas four-engine transports continued, bridging the gap between wartime necessity and the dawn of modern intercontinental flight. By the early 1950s, the world of aviation was changing rapidly. Jet propulsion was no longer theoretical. Engineers in multiple countries were pushing the boundaries of speed and altitude. Military doctrine was evolving around high-altitude bombers and fast interceptors. Commercial airlines were beginning to imagine a future beyond piston engines. And yet, across continents, the Douglas DC-4 descended from the experimental DC-4 continued to fly. What had once been considered overly ambitious in 1938 had, through simplification and adaptation, become one of the most dependable large transports of its era. Its wartime service as a C-54 Skymaster had proven its durability. Its post-war conversion into civilian transports had proven its economic viability. Airlines rebuilding after World War II needed aircraft that were available, affordable, and capable of long-range service. The DC-4 4 met all three requirements. Hundreds of surplus C-54s were converted for passenger use. Military interiors were stripped out. Windows were reconfigured. Cabins were redesigned with seating layouts suited to commercial travel. Some aircraft were modified for cargo operations, creating flexible fleets for emerging international carriers. In Europe, devastated infrastructure required rapid reconstruction of transport networks. The DC-4 became a workhorse for airlines re-establishing routes between capitals. In Latin America, it connected growing economies across long distances where rail and road infrastructure remained limited. In Asia and Africa, it helped lay the foundation for modern civil aviation systems. The aircraft's unpressurized cabin meant it typically cruised at lower altitudes compared to later airliners, but remained efficient and reliable. For many passengers in the late 1940s and early 1950s, stepping aboard a DC-4 represented entry into a new era of global mobility. Meanwhile, Douglas was already developing more advanced aircraft. The DC-6, introduced in the late 1940s, incorporated pressurization and improved performance. It was followed by the DC-7, which pushed piston engine technology to its limits with greater speed and range. These aircraft represented the true realization of the long-range luxury vision that had originally inspired the DC-4E concept. Yet the DC-4 continued operating alongside its more advanced siblings. It was simpler, less expensive to maintain, and adaptable to a wide variety of roles. In military service, the C-54 did not disappear at the end of World War II. During the Korean War, which began in 1950, the aircraft once again played a crucial logistical role. Transporting troops and supplies to the Korean peninsula required sustained airlift capability. Though newer aircraft were entering service, the C-54 remained a dependable part of the network. It carried personnel between Japan and Korea. It evacuated wounded soldiers. It delivered essential cargo to forward bases. Once again, the aircraft demonstrated that strategic mobility often determines operational effectiveness. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically from the multipolar tensions of the 1930s to the bipolar structure of the Cold War. Air power now served not only wartime operations, but also political signaling and alliance building. The United States supplied transport aircraft, including variants of the DC-4 and C-54, to allied nations. This distribution expanded the global footprint of the design even further. What began as an American commercial experiment had evolved into a worldwide platform serving dozens of countries. The jet age formally arrived for commercial aviation in the late 1950s. Aircraft such as the de Havilland Comet and later the Boeing 707 introduced jet-powered passenger travel. Pressurized cabins, higher cruising altitudes, and dramatically increased speeds redefined expectations. Travel time shrank. Comfort improved. Aviation entered a new technological phase. Against this backdrop, piston engine transports like the DC-4 began to appear dated. Yet retirement was gradual rather than immediate. Jets were expensive. Not all routes justified high-speed aircraft. Smaller airlines in developing nations continued to rely on piston engine fleets well into the 1960s and beyond. Freighter conversions extended the life of many DC-4s. Cargo operations, particularly in remote regions, valued durability over speed. In some parts of the world, DC-4 aircraft operated on rugged routes where jet infrastructure was impractical. The aircraft's straightforward systems and proven reliability made it attractive for operators who prioritized practicality over prestige. Looking back, the contrast between the DC-4's sustained global service and the brief, troubled life of the Nakajima G5N becomes even more striking. The G5N had been born from urgency, an attempt to accelerate heavy bomber development by drawing inspiration from foreign technology. But without the industrial depth and engine reliability to support it, the project faltered. The DC-4, by contrast, succeeded not through revolutionary experimentation, but through disciplined simplification and incremental refinement. The experimental DC-4E had been ambitious to the point of impracticality. Its triple tail, advanced electrical systems, and complex architecture pushed the limits of what airlines could support in the late 1930s. When those complexities were removed, the underlying aerodynamic and structural strengths of the design flourished. In many ways, the true legacy of the DC-3 lies not in its direct achievements, but in the lessons it taught. It demonstrated the risks of over-engineering. It revealed the operational realities of large four-engine aircraft. It provided a foundation, both technically and conceptually, for more successful successors. And through its sale to Japan, it inadvertently influenced an entirely separate line of development, even if that line did not achieve lasting success. By the 1960s, most major airlines in North America and Europe had transitioned fully to pressurized piston aircraft and then to jets. The DC-4 moved increasingly into secondary roles: cargo hauling, charter operations, and service in remote regions. Some aircraft found new lives with firefighting operators, modified to drop retardant over forest fires. Others were used in scientific expeditions or specialized transport missions. Gradually, numbers dwindled. Airframes accumulated thousands of flight hours. Maintenance costs rose. Replacement parts became harder to source. One by one, aircraft were retired, dismantled, or scrapped. Yet a small number survived beyond purely commercial utility. Aviation enthusiasts and preservationists began recognizing the historical importance of early four-engine transports. Museums acquired airframes. Restoration groups sought to return surviving aircraft to flying condition. What had once been everyday workhorses became artifacts of a transformative period in aviation history. The arc that began in 1935 with William Patterson's bold proposal had now stretched across 3 decades. The original DC-3 had flown only briefly. It had failed commercially. It had crossed the Pacific under ambiguous circumstances. It had influenced a troubled bomber program. It had been dismantled far from where it was built, yet its conceptual DNA persisted. In the C-54 that sustained global logistics, in the DC for that rebuilt post-war air travel, and in the broader evolution of long-range transport aircraft that followed. As jets took command of the skies, the piston era did not vanish overnight. Instead, it receded gradually, leaving behind aircraft that had quietly connected continents during war and peace alike. In the final chapter of this story, we will look at the long-term legacy of the DC-4 family, how its influence extended beyond its operational lifespan, and how a single experimental airliner became part of a much larger narrative about innovation, adaptation, and the unpredictable paths technology can take. By the time the last Douglas DC-4 aircraft began disappearing from regular service, the world it had helped connect looked nothing like the one in which it was conceived. When William Patterson first proposed a four-engine transcontinental airliner in 1935, long-distance air travel was still experimental, expensive, and uncertain. By the 1960s and 1970s, intercontinental flight had become routine. Jets crossed oceans in hours. Airports expanded into massive international hubs. Aviation was no longer a daring novelty. It was infrastructure. And yet, quietly woven into that transformation was the legacy of an aircraft that had once been considered a failure. The DC-4 had not succeeded commercially. Airlines had found it too complex and too costly. Its advanced systems overwhelmed late 1930s operational realities. Only one prototype was built. On paper, it was an evolutionary dead end. But in practice, it was a beginning. The lessons learned from the DC-4 reshaped Douglas's engineering philosophy. Simplification replaced ambition for its own sake. Reliability was prioritized over experimental complexity. Structural strength was balanced with maintainability. These lessons directly informed the production DC-4, which in turn became the C-54 Skymaster, the aircraft that would help sustain global Allied operations during World War II. The C-54's contribution to victory was not measured in bombs dropped or dogfights won. It was measured in tonnage delivered, in troops transported, in wounded soldiers evacuated, and in supply lines maintained across oceans. It proved that strategic mobility could be as decisive as firepower. Then came the Berlin airlift, where the aircraft again demonstrated that air power could serve humanitarian and political objectives without firing a shot. In that moment, the four-engine transport became a symbol of endurance and resolve. From war to crisis to reconstruction, the design lineage that began with the DC-3 quietly reshaped global logistics. Across the Pacific, the story had taken a different path. The Nakajima G5N program, born from Japan's acquisition and study of the DC-4E, never achieved the strategic breakthrough its designers had hoped for. Mechanical limitations, engine reliability problems, and the pressures of wartime production constrained its development. The aircraft did not become Japan's answer to Allied heavy bombers. It did not redefine long-range strike capability. Instead, it became a cautionary example of the limits of reverse engineering under industrial strain. Studying an aircraft structure was one thing. Replicating the ecosystem of manufacturing, material science, engine refinement, and logistical support behind it was another. The divergence between the American and Japanese outcomes highlights a broader truth about aviation innovation during the mid-20th century. Success required not just design insight, but industrial depth and sustained development capacity. The DC-4E, though dismantled and lost, played a role in both narratives. As decades passed, piston engine transports gradually yielded to turboprops and jets. Aircraft such as the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 ushered in the true jet age of commercial travel. Speed doubled. Cabin pressurization became standard. Range increased dramatically. Yet even in the jet era, the foundational concepts refined through the DC-4 family endured. The tricycle landing gear configuration pioneered on the DC-4E became standard across virtually all large aircraft that followed. The emphasis on long-range structural integrity informed post-war design philosophy. The global route networks established with C-54 and DC-4 aircraft formed the backbone of modern international airline systems. In many parts of the world, former military C-54s continued flying cargo well into the 1970s. Some operated in remote regions where rugged reliability mattered more than speed. Others were converted into firefighting aircraft or specialized transports. A handful survived into preservation. Aviation museums and restoration groups recognized that these aircraft represented more than aging machinery. They embodied a turning point in aviation history. The moment when four-engine land planes became practical, scalable, and globally transformative. Today, restored C-54 and DC-4 aircraft appear at air shows and historical commemorations. Their polished aluminum skins reflect sunlight much as they did decades ago. Visitors walk beneath their broad wings, often unaware that behind their clean lines lies a story of ambition, miscalculation, adaptation, and eventual success. The complete arc of the DC-4E and its descendants spans commerce, war, espionage, industrial rivalry, humanitarian crisis, and global integration. It began with a bold civilian vision in the United States, an attempt to leap forward in passenger aviation. It stumbled under its own complexity. It crossed oceans under ambiguous circumstances. It influenced a military project abroad that failed to meet expectations. It was dismantled, and yet, from its lessons emerged one of the most important transport aircraft families of the 20th century. The story challenges simple definitions of success and failure. Was the DC-4E failure because it was never mass-produced? Or was it successful because it revealed the path forward? Was the sale to Japan merely a commercial transaction? Or did it become an unexpected chapter in the technological competition that shaped the Pacific War? History rarely unfolds in straight lines. The DC-4E's life was brief, but its impact was diffuse, spreading through derivative designs, industrial practices, and global networks. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the story is what it reveals about innovation itself. Ambitious designs often overreach. Early prototypes frequently expose practical limitations. Industrial ecosystems determine whether ideas flourish or fade. And sometimes, an aircraft that fails in its original mission becomes foundational in ways its designers never anticipated. When the lone DC-4E prototype lifted off from Cloverfield in June 1938, few could have predicted its complicated future. It was meant to carry passengers across the United States in comfort. Instead, it would influence wartime logistics, trans-Pacific engineering efforts, Cold War airlift operations, and rebuilding of global civil aviation. By the time the final operational DC-4s were retired from regular service, they had connected continents, supported military campaigns, sustained blockaded cities, and transported millions of passengers. The physical prototype that inspired it all no longer exists. Its aluminum was scrapped, its structure dismantled, but its conceptual imprint remains embedded in the evolution of large aircraft design. Standing on a modern airport ramp today, surrounded by wide-body jets capable of carrying hundreds of passengers across oceans nonstop, it is easy to forget how revolutionary the idea once seemed. A four-engine land plane crossing a continent without refueling was once a daring proposition. Cabin comfort at high altitude was experimental. Global air networks were theoretical. The DC-3 emerged at that moment of uncertainty. It faltered. It taught hard lessons. And from those lessons, a more practical aircraft rose, one that helped define mid-century aviation. In the end, the DC-4's legacy is not tied to its flight hours or production numbers. It is tied to its influence. It stands as a reminder that progress often comes through iteration, that failure can refine ambition, and that even a single experimental airframe can leave a mark that spans oceans and generations. From the boardrooms of 1935 to the skies over Berlin, from American factories to Japanese naval workshops, the story of the DC-4 and its descendants is a testament to how technology travels, adapts, and reshapes the world, sometimes in ways no one originally intended.